All right, welcome back, everybody. This is lecture number 4, Absolute Monarchy in England. Yeah, so we have learned about absolute monarchs in Western Europe, Central Europe, and Russia. So what about England, you ask? Great question. Oh, what a forward thinker you are. You go. Right, so England was different from other Western European absolute monarchies. And it had a lot to do with the fact that for a long time, monarchs in England had been limited in power by their nobles. Remember 1215? King John losing tons of territory to the French and making his nobles mad because he'd used their money to fight an unsuccessful war? Yeah, poor John the Soft Sword, who was, if you recall, Richard the Lionhearted's less successful bro. Yeah, so King John signed that important document in history called the Magna Carta, or the Great Charter, and it was one of the first times in history that a monarch's power was limited. Well, ever since then, kings and queens in England, they're going to have to start to share their power with nobles, who had created a legislative body, or lawmaking body, called Parliament. So absolute monarchy never really caught on in England the way it had in places like France. Okay, so don't get me wrong, that's not to say that monarchs didn't try to rule absolutely. Yeah, like, just because you're not allowed to go on Facebook in the computer lab doesn't mean you all haven't tried to find a way to log in. Oh yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Actually, I meant to sound like Despicable Me then. That's what I'm talking about. Okay, I wasn't very successful with that, but moving on. Unfortunately, kings in England who attempted to rule absolutely didn't always get too far. And some of them actually lost their heads, literally. So let's talk about that. Okay, first, write this down in your notes and repeat after me. Cromwell sandwich. Cromwell sandwich. Say it. That's right. Cromwell sandwich. Yes, a Cromwell sandwich will help you remember the order of English rulers. And no, we're not going cannibal. Bear with me. James Charles Cromwell. Charles James. Let's say that again. James Charles Cromwell. Charles James. Say that again. Another time. James Charles Cromwell. Charles James. Yes, that's the order of kings, and Cromwell was in the middle. Cromwell sandwich. So that's the order of kings and leaders in England until almost 1689. So say it again. I will quiz you on it. James Charles Cromwell. Charles James. And now, let me tell you about these people. After Elizabeth I died in 1603, the first of the Stuart family monarchs took power. James Stuart, a.k.a. James I, took power. He was Elizabeth's cousin, in case you're interested. He fought with Parliament constantly, including a group of Protestants called the Puritans. They wanted James to get rid of all Catholic practices from the Church of England, and he refused. So when James I's son, Charles I, took power, Parliament tried to control the new king. But Charles I wasn't interested in sharing power with Parliament. He would often dissolve it or basically claim it no longer existed whenever they had a difference of opinion. In addition to dissolving Parliament, he was known to jail people without just cause. He would raise taxes without asking for Parliament's permission. So Parliament had him sign a document called the Petition of Right, which was supposed to prevent him from doing such things. The problem was that Charles I simply ignored the document he signed. This is going to result in the English Civil War. Yes, England had a civil war too, yes, and I'm not talking about a soccer match between the Scots and Irish. Anyway, the English Civil War was not just a fight over power between Parliament and the King. It was also about religion. Remember, it was Henry VIII who established the Anglican Church when the Catholic Church refused to grant him a divorce from his first wife. We're going to see Catholic and Protestant kings and queens in England trying to make the Anglican and Catholic churches the primary churches of England, on and off, depending on the king or queen's personal views. Charles I was an Anglican, a Protestant, but was arguing with the Puritans, other groups of Protestants who wanted a less Catholic form of Protestantism in England. In fact, many people in Scotland, which was controlled by England, practiced a form of Protestantism called Presbyterianism, and they felt like Charles wasn't looking out for their interests. So all these types of things are going to result in a civil war for the English. Now, the English Civil War had two sides. On one side, dun, 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 they were the Royalists, also called the Cavaliers, who supported King Charles. On the other team, opposed to the king, were the Puritans, who were nicknamed the Roundheads because of the cool bowl-cut hairstyles they wore. Anyway, the Civil War lasted from 1642 until 1649. And one of the most powerful and inspirational leaders for the Puritans was a guy named Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell and his fellow Puritans won, and they placed King Charles under arrest and sentenced him to death. He was beheaded via axe in 1649. Nice. Ouch. Then, long story short, Cromwell began ruling England Cromwell style. No, not Gangnam style. No, Cromwell style. He was semi-democratic at first, but very quickly became a dictator. He crushed an uprising in Ireland, and he tried to make England as Puritan as possible. Things like dancing and theatre, with an R-E on the end, theatre, were abolished as sinful activities. Strict morality was forced on society. Puritans, like Cromwell, had religious toleration for the various sects of Protestantism that existed at the time. However, there was no toleration for Catholics. Okay, so let's review. James Charles Cromwell, Charles James. Yep, we're on the Cromwell portion now. So what happened to Cromwell, and why was there another James? Okay, so Cromwell died in 1658, and a new parliament came into existence. The English people decided they needed a king to rule with parliament again. So they invited Charles I's oldest son, Charles, to the throne. Charles II. And of course, think about this. If your dad had been beheaded for not working with Parliament, what would you do? Right. How might that inspire your rule? You might, and I'm just going to take a guess here, you might be willing to say, work closely with Parliament for fear of losing your head, right? So the English restored a king to power in 1660. And this restoration of a king to power after a period of instability is called by the same name, the Restoration, which looks and should be pronounced like restoration, but it's restoration. So practice that so you don't sound incredibly uneducated. Right. So under Charles II, Parliament was able to pass many guarantees of freedom, including something called habeas corpus, which is a Latin legal term that translates to have the body. This law basically prevented kings from throwing people in jail just for not liking them, and they actually had to be accused of a crime, and they couldn't spend too long in jail without a trial. Okay, so Charles II was cool and all with Parliament. The problem? Yeah, no legal heir, no son. But he did have a brother named James. Dun dun dun, but James was Catholic. Hello! So many people were opposed to his becoming king. Two political parties emerged in England as a result of this predicament. The first was the Whig Party, W-H-I-G, that is, who were opposed to James becoming king. The other was the Tories Party that supported James in becoming the king. This is significant now because these two parties marked the beginning of two major political parties in England. All the way back in the late 1600s. Who knew? Right, so Charles II died, and his brother James II took over. He very quickly became unpopular because he wasn't working well with Parliament, and he was super duper Catholic. He also dissolved Parliament at one point when he disagreed with his nobles. It looked as though James II might be heading down the same road as his dad. The solution? Well, James's oldest daughter, Mary, was Protestant and was married to King William of Orange of the Netherlands. So members of Parliament secretly asked Mary and her hubby to come back to England and overthrow Mary's dad, James II. Which, hey, the prospect of ruling England was probably pretty sweet. So Mary and William were like, oh yeah, and they overthrew James II, and they were supported by Parliament. This was a bloodless overthrow, fortunately, and it became known as, write this down, the Glorious Revolution. Write that down, Glorious Revolution. Right. So William and Mary, write this down, established a constitutional monarchy, which means they had a constitution, hence the name constitutional monarchy. Get it? This is where laws limit the power of the king. These laws collectively became known as the English Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights limited rulers' power. The Bill of Rights made it clear that kings couldn't abolish Parliament whenever they disagreed. Additionally, kings were no longer allowed to levy or make taxes without Parliament's consent or permission. The Bill of Rights also provided for freedom of speech, in Parliament that is, not the general public, but they also allowed common citizens to complain to the king about things they didn't like without penalty. So the fact that both William and Mary agreed to these rules it shows that this was a limited monarchy. And this is so important to remember. You know, I know I've covered a lot here today, but I need you to come away with these few facts. Listen up. Unlike other nations in Western Europe, where leaders ruled absolutely with few checks on their power, England was different. There was a pressing desire in England to limit their king's power and hold them accountable to the people. So after 1688, no king could rule England without Parliament's permission. Eventually, to prevent disagreements between Parliament and the king that would potentially cause the government to come to a standstill, England will see the establishment of the cabinet system, where a group of governing ministers or officials, called a cabinet, act in the ruler's name, but also represent whatever majority political party is in power in Parliament. This group became the link between the monarch and the ruling political party in Parliament and was a further check on a monarch's power. Over time, this cabinet is going to increase their power, and today the head of this cabinet or the majority party in Great Britain is called a prime minister. And although the monarch in England today still enjoys the right to sit in on government functions and meetings and is kept in the loop of government affairs, the monarchy in Great Britain today is largely ceremonial, but highly entertaining. I mean, did you check out the wedding? Yeah, royal wedding. Hello. Right. So what we need to remember is that England was different, and they're going to limit the power of their monarchs and not allow kings and queens to rule absolutely. Thanks for listening. Bye.